Bloodbath, beheading, or sexual exploitation. These are common when it comes to Vikings' punishments. Brutality was one of the dominant characteristics of the Vikings, and the slaves were the ones who had to witness this ruthless destiny. Want to know about this? Stay tuned till the end of the video. Norsemen from present-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were the majority who plundered, raided, conquered, and colonized numerous parts of Europe during the Viking Age. Generations of non-Viking people were terrified when they saw the longships of the Vikings towering over the horizon. There were combatants of such fame and notoriety that even the Byzantine in Constantinople engaged them in this prestigious Varangian Guard due to their reputation for cruelty and ferocity. According to Viking law, murdering someone covertly and without fair notice is regarded as a horrible deed as opposed to killing someone in a duel after openly confronting them. Even in cases of manslaughter or unintentional fatalities, the offender had to accept responsibility and not flee. Pay the fine that has been levied on you and heed the advice. The same holds true for murders that happen after fights or other similar incidents. However, there was a chance you could be asked to do the fatal walk if you were discovered murdering them while they were asleep, without being surprised or given adequate notice. This penalty was often only meted out for notorious killings, like the instance of Broer in the Njal Saga. The Vikings possessed slaves, sometimes known as thralls, in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. In Viking civilization 1,000 years ago, these thralls undoubtedly held several positions and assisted their lords in a variety of ways. When significant Vikings pass away, they could also be assigned the final difficult assignment. Some slaves died with their owners. Cattle, pigs, and sheep could be found in many regions of Scandinavia and Iceland, and records indicate that herding was seen as a job solely fit for male slaves. This was one of the main responsibilities of a male slave. Meanwhile, labor in the fields was divided. While freemen were in charge of plowing or sowing, slaves would be in charge of fertilizing the fields with dung. Together, slaves and masters would gather hay and work throughout the harvest. Other tasks that were designated for slaves included cutting grass from the ground and carrying a shovel and rope around. There were some slaves who worked in the forest, went hunting, and fished. According to written records, the Vikings traded slaves in trade hubs like Hadeby and Bulgar in the Volga. Slaves were bought, sold, and traded for various goods here. Potential customers include Viking farmers who may employ slaves for domestic duties as well as the heaviest and most painful field labor. A sizable number of slaves most likely contributed a share of the labor force for the massive Viking Age construction endeavors. Slaves were trafficked by other people than the Vikings. Western Europe also trafficked slaves, but selling other countrymen was uncommon in this region. The church opposed Vikings, who were the heathens, from taking Christians as slaves. According to one tale, a monk was so horrified to witness Christian slaves being auctioned in Hadeby in 870 that he sold all he owned and personally paid for the captives' liberation. Because of this, European and Nordic slave smugglers for a long time had an easy target among the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe. It should be noted that the word slave first appeared in this region. In the Viking era, up to 10% of the people in Scandinavia may have been slaves. They could have been abducted and become slaves. They could have been taken prisoner during Viking raids, but they might also have fallen into debt and been forced to engage in lifelong service to pay off their debts. It is evident that the thralls made up the lowest stratum in society is Rigsthula, one of Iceland's Edda poems. They were assigned difficult and unpleasant chores on the farms, including mining peat or caring for pigs. They could also be sexually exploited. In Viking-era territories, slaves were either prisoner taken in battle, home intruders, or people paying off debts. With a slave network extending from Ireland all the way to Russia, there were incredibly significant commodities for the Viking economy. Slavery was frequently employed as a punishment for various domestic offenses committed by Vikings. For instance, a lady convicted of stealing may be made to serve her victim. Being made into a slave as payment for a debt or transgression was by no means a mild penalty for a Viking. Thralls had very little rights and their owners were free to beat and mistreat them. Highborn lords frequently had one or two slaves buried with them because they required someone to serve them in the hereafter, because their punishment for many of them seemed to go on forever. An old lady known as the Angel of Death would slay the master's slave daughters in several sections of Viking-era Eastern Europe. The Viking was transported to be buried beside her employer after being strangled by a couple of guys inside a makeshift tent at the funeral home as an elderly woman stabbed her in the heart. Slaves were seen as cattle, or highly developed domestic animals, often resided in the longhouse's darkest end alongside other domestic animals. Slaves were beaten if they displayed improper behavior. Any amount of discipline was up to the master. Additionally, the slaves' bodies may be used for sexual exploitation. This is reported in the Arabic diplomat Ibn Fadlan's narrative of his encounter with several Vikings on the Volga in 922. He recalls how the proprietors of the two pretty ladies who were to be auctioned sexually assaulted them while others looked on. However, particularly beautiful slave girls and high-status female captives of war may live in comfort and gain respect. The same likely applied to male slaves as well, who were very accomplished artisans. The raids included the acquisition of people, more especially slaves. They were known as slave trails. They acquired them in various ways, most frequently stolen in raids across Europe. But there were also those born into slavery or made slaves as punishment for their crimes. The Viking Age historians tell a story of when they invaded Northumberland in England, burned an abbey at Lindisfarne, and killed or enslaved the monks who lived there. Although people occasionally sold themselves to pay off debts, the Norse thrall age system was not slavery as we know it today. As we told earlier, punishment in Viking society was frequently based on social standing. Thralls received worse punishment than free men. Yet, if a thrall committed a robbery under master's orders, the master received a harsher punishment. As a form of harsh punishment, different types of mutilation were occasionally utilized in different places. Harsh legislation was passed by Sinan, the illustrious Danish king of England from 1016 and 1035, and it perished with him. It stated that a woman who committed adultery would be forced to remove her nose and ears, but males would only be reprimanded. The Bjarki regulations of Sweden, which some academics believe may have originated as early as 832, stipulated that anybody caught stealing while on a trade excursion would be subjected to tarring and feathering. Duck feathers were thrown on top after his head had been shaved and smeared with tar. The other merchants then took a position facing inward in two long parallel lines. The unfortunate man covered in feathers was forced to dodge the guys who were about to pelt him with bricks and stones. Anyone who didn't toss something at the feathery guy risks a fine. The thief received no additional penalty if he survived the obstacle course. A Viking cemetery in Flakstad in the Lofoten Islands of Norway has also been studied by Elise Naumann, an archaeologist and postdoc at the University of Oslo. The deceased, who was with a person of high status, had also been beheaded in this case, and it's assumed that they were slaves. Naumann brings up the theories of Uppsala University archaeologist Neil Price. He has noted that although having certain similarities, each of these burials is unique. They contain different grave goods and evidence of various forms of brutality or murder committed against the slaves. In any event, it appears that many slaves died at a violent end. Elise Naumann also believes it is likely that many slaves originated from the same regions as the other Viking inhabitants. The female slaves might have given birth to lots of children, even though the master had sired many of these kids. Such offspring could still grow up as slaves, says Naumann. Slaves' freedom might be purchased by outside parties or, in rare instances, granted by their masters. Toki Smith raised the stone in remembrance of Orgsil Guðmundar's son, who granted him gold and freedom, is written on the runestone from Jutland. It reveals that the artisan Toki was granted his release. Slavery decreased once Christianity was introduced, but it wasn't until much later, during the medieval era, that it was totally abolished. However, the Civil Code Codex Holmiensis from this year includes laws pertaining to slaves, suggesting that the practice was still in place in 1241. So what do you think about the punishment of slaves? Comment below and let us know. Also, make sure to subscribe to the channel and don't forget to press the bell icon. We'll catch up with you in the next video.